So we're recording this meeting, and I'm going to show you an agenda. We do have a fairly tight schedule. We did it as clear as we could. So hold on, I'll go through very quickly. So you'll see that we're going to go through, and the format's going to be that there'll be presentation, and then we will allow questions afterwards. So as you have questions during the
Ellen Sullivan joined the meeting.
As you have questions during the meeting, during the presentation, we ask that you put them into the chat box. I'm noticing we're having some people join by phone, which is absolutely fine. But if you put them into the chat box, Gail Volk.
A lot of people on foot on Anthony Street.
Hey guys, I'm going to, can we mute everyone for a minute?
Which is perfectly park permissible.
All right, so I'm unmuted now. So general Zoom general Zoom etiquette, please keep yourself on mute unless you're going to speak. So as the presentation goes on, if you have a question, it will be best if you type it into the chat box. I'll also call if people are on the phone and have questions. And then, so we'll end up addressing the questions after each topic. We have somebody doing timing because we do have a pretty full schedule. So we're going to go election legislation, redistricting. Jennifer's talk about that transparency during the legislative processing, which really just got addressed, court reform, J-COPE, education, financing, medical aid in dying, environmental, and then we'll close. So I ask that everyone just pretty much join in as you can. Please do. We will be obviously minding the clock. And if anything doesn't get addressed, please put it into the chat and we will address it as we can afterwards as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer Wilson. Thank you, Jennifer, for joining.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And I do just want to say, we do have one other issue specialist on here, Barb Thomas, who is our women's issues and medical aid and dying specialist. So thank you, Barb, also for being here.
Yes.
So I'm going to do a quick screen share. And if you were with us 2 years ago at our in-person Capital Region legislative meeting, then you'll remember we started with just talking about kind of giving a lay of the land. And I know we're on a super short time frame, but as Patricia mentioned, one of the things that we were working on happened yesterday. So I don't think we need as much time for that. So I do just want to mention really quickly that we do have a super majority now in the Senate and in the Assembly of Democrats. So we essentially have a veto-proof majority in both houses. So I just did want to mention that. It's very different from, well, maybe not very different, it's pretty different from where we were 2 years ago. And I also want to mention that actually we had a couple of seats change in the Capital Region as well. Not here, these are all the same friendly faces that I'm sure most of you are familiar with, but you'll notice one new one here. Matthew Simpson took over Dan Steck's seat in the Assembly. And then on the Senate side, Michelle Hinchy now has George Amador's seat. And I have listed here the counties and areas that they cover. And then also on the Senate side, Dan Steck now has Betty Little's seat. So we have just a couple of members in the Capital Region that have changed. So I think it's great to do kind of like an intro meeting with your league if any of these members represent you. If it's Dan Steck, then you probably already knew him from when he was in the Assembly, but it's always helpful to just kind of have like one of those reminder meetings. And that's a kind of a great segue into our legislative agenda, which there was a link sent around with our agenda for this year. We are not printing as many copies as we normally do because we are anticipating that we will mostly be remote through session. There's not going to be lobby days. There's not going to be people at the Capitol. There's not going to be, the hustle and bustle there. We won't really have the opportunity to hand these out. We did print out a small number, which we will be sending to every new member in the coming week, so that at least the new members who we haven't had the chance to have a face-to-face with and probably won't have a chance to have a face-to-face, we could have a Zoom to Zoom, but that's probably as good as we're going to get, will at least have the league on their radar and at least have our legislative agenda, and then we can always move forward with them on certain issues. So that is my little 5-minute plug. Here is what we're going to be covering today, starting with probably our biggest issue area. And Kate Doran is our new election specialist. She is based in New York City. She's a board member. She is amazing. And she's going to be helping me go through this. So we're going to kind of do a little take turn on this. So starting with funding needs, if you recall, every single year we advocate for funding for the State Board of Elections. Sometimes for their own function, they're typically underfunded. Last year, it feels very weird saying last year, but in 2020, they were underfunded by more than $1 million for that year. And that was pre-COVID. They were underfunded at this extremely high rate. They never got that money back when the budget was finalized during the pandemic. And they just need money. They're always needing money. They're always getting budget cuts every single year. They get a cut. In the entire time I've been with the league, they've gotten a cut consistently every single year. And now more than ever, they need money because if you recall, back in 2019, the Campaign Finance Commission was created. So now we have a Campaign Finance Commission that is supposed to be part of the State Board of Elections. So it's the State Board essentially taking on a whole nother agency into their agency. And if they don't have money, they really can't make that happen. And then something else we have been advocating for funding for since its passage in 2019 as well is early voting. So we had advocated pre-COVID for funding for early voting, knowing that in 2020 was going to be a major election year. Unfortunately, we were not listened to, and there was no additional funds for early voting for counties. So we are going to continue to beat the drum that there needs to be some sort of funding stream every single year for counties to actually do early voting. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kate to talk about Board of Election reform.
Hi, thank you, Jennifer. Jennifer is very, very kind to me, but I must say that she's a superstar, and I could not even imagine doing anything that I do without having her support. So, Board of Election Reform is a rabbit hole. It's, I don't know if you know, but the county boards of election predate the state board. The State Board of Election did not even come into being until the 1970s. So there is quite a lot of tension often between the county boards and the state boards of election. And it's a problem because there are constitutional issues here. The Board of Elections, the structure, the protection of the Democrats versus the Republicans is in the state constitution. And we're developing a position at the league that we would like to see state Board of Elections reform. And it's complicated, so stay tuned. And I would really be excited if you could if you have any members who are interested in this particular issue. And I'm from New York City, as Jennifer mentioned, and New York City is wildly different from the rest of the state. We don't have those funding problems. The New York City Board of Elections can spend whatever it wants, and the City Council in New York, which is the legislative body in New York City, they make the Board of Elections whole. The numbers, the dollar amounts are breathtaking that have been spent in New York City in connection with the early voting, and then when they had to institute protocols around the pandemic. So money is not the issue, but the political, intervention of nonpartisan people like us is important because they are everything that happens in the New York City Board of Elections and in upstate counties as well is dictated by the political parties. And that's the way the law is written, and that's what the Constitution has to say. So we really do need to study this closely and develop positions about what we would like to see. We don't have anything firm yet, but we would love all the league members in the state to have an interest in their county board of elections, to look at the websites from their BOEs, which is a really simple thing to do, to ask their county boards of elections whether they have meetings, and if they don't have public meetings, ask them for the minutes of the meetings that they do have, and pay attention to them. Everybody likes to have attention paid, and they will change if we pay attention to them and demand changes. Nope.
Great. So we did have, there has been, and I should have mentioned this earlier, I didn't list any legislation specific numbers. There are bills related to a lot of these, but since it's a brand new session, I haven't had a chance to go through and see which pieces have been introduced. So I didn't want to give you guys old bill numbers, but bill numbers on a lot of these will definitely be forthcoming. In the case of this particular reform, there's a reform at the New York City level that's been introduced, but there isn't a statewide one yet. But these are the basic things that we're asking for. So staffing and salary standards, transparency and accountability, which ideally would include having open meetings for all the county boards of elections. New York City is definitely an outlier in that they have regular meetings that people can attend virtually and in person when it's not COVID, and uniform standards and practices, which would include a lot of the other things that we look at, whether it's curing absentee ballots or, really just anything, just having everybody have the same thing. It's a lot easier for us too, as voting rights advocates, to be able to tell people what's going on in their, whether they're in Hamilton County or Herkimer County, hopefully they're doing the same thing. But moving on from that, early voting expansion. During COVID, this kind of flew under the radar, but if you all recall, Neil Breslin's bill related directly to Rensselaer County to mandate that there be a early voting poll site in the largest municipality of every county did pass. So that's really great, and it was signed into law. And that also removed, or it raised the number of mandated sites to 10 from 8 or 6. Now I can't even remember which one it is. It's either 6 or 8, but there's a maximum threshold. I think it's 8 that the state can require you to have, and you could of course go above that threshold, but per 50,000 residents, you have to have 1 poll site, and then the maximum number you have to be mandated to have is 8. And while that was great for the initial rollout, obviously we saw from the 2020 election, early voting is hot right now. Everyone wants to vote early. So there is legislation that has been introduced that would remove the cap on sites and also decrease the number of registered voters from 50,000 to 25,000. This opens up another can of worms, though, as far as having to address funding needs. So it's definitely something that we are supportive of, but we are being conscious that this is an increased cost. And Kate, did you want to talk about counting of absentee ballots?
I'd be happy to. It's as Jennifer said, it's as hot as early voting. Everyone wants to vote absentee. And fortunately, we are already on track to have the 2 constitutional amendments on the ballot in November. The first one for no excuse absentee balloting, which I can tell you the league has been working on for decades, and also same-day registration, which will be, I believe, a game changer. So those are all very good things. We just need we need to lobby our legislators to make sure they don't forget about this and do this like on day 2 or 3 when they convene.
Oops, sorry.
Pass those identical bills, and then it'll be on the ballot in November for all the voters. Now, the counting absentee ballots is complicated. It shouldn't be, but it is. And it's such a wonky topic, but I think this is a very high information crowd, so you probably all know that in New York State, they don't start counting the ballots until 7 days after the election. Now, there are a couple of reasons for this. The ones that are that everyone would acknowledge are good reasons are they want to allow military and absentee ballots, overseas ballots to get in, and they want to give them time to do that. And they also, in New York State, we have a very unusual system that permits voters to vote in person, even if they have already completed and submitted an absentee ballot. Not because they've decided that they wanted to change their mind, but the thinking originally was that if you thought you were going to be out of the county, which is what the reason to apply for an absentee ballot is that you're not going to be present in the county on election day. And then all of a sudden, wonder of wonders, you've recovered from, you're not sick anymore, your travel schedule has changed, and you are in the county. The default is to vote in person. That's what the law wants you to do, to vote in person. So you vote in person, and then all the county boards of elections have to examine their voting records. And if you voted absentee, your absentee ballot is voided and your in-person vote is counted. So obviously that takes time throughout the state. So that is the reason that we don't start to count absentee ballots until 7 days later. And this is another issue that we have very wise heads like Jennifer and working, devising what position we want to have on this topic. And all of you folks, I guess, need to be thinking about it as well and weigh in with us. It's complicated. I mean, we don't want to disenfranchise anyone, but we certainly do want to count ballots as soon as we possibly can. And there are bills out there. Jennifer, I don't know if we have the 2021 numbers, but there are some bills out there.
Yeah, no, you totally nailed it, Kate, as far as, and it's something that the Let New York Vote Coalition is looking at collaboratively, which is great because they have so many lawyers that are in the coalition that can really look at this from a legal standpoint, which is a great segue into the next one, which I am going to kick to Kate, but I just do want to mention restoration of voting rights for justice involved individuals, that there was a letter that went out right at the holidays that we didn't have our weekly update that week, but there was a letter that the league signed on to calling for full restoration of voting rights for those justice involved individuals. Of course, we all know that in New York State, it's really only when people on parole are the ones who'd have to basically fight to have their right restored. There was an executive order that was done, but it's really limited. And of course, executive orders are not the be all end all, but Kate was on the grassroots call with Let New York Vote that I missed. So I'm going to let her finish my thought.
Okay. Well, as you all, I'm sure, know, that League of Women Voters New York State is part of the Let New York Vote Coalition. And thank goodness for that. I mean, we had this plethora of voting reform legislation that happened in 2019, and it will continue. And we really are, we are enhanced, our positions are enhanced, but we are valued as well in the Let New York Vote Coalition. So on Tuesday, the conversation went to how should we message about justice involved individuals? And the consensus was that these are returning citizens. We shouldn't even be discussing what happened when they were convicted of felonies and they had to serve time, or they're on parole or probation or whatever. These are returning individuals. And if we speak to our more conservative or Republican representatives, we can say to them, what's happening now is very, very complicated and expensive. The governor has to, and the governor's staff have to put people on, what is it, Jennifer?
It's a partial pardon. So they have like a list of, people who get a partial pardon.
It is very complicated and no one understands it. And if we simply want to take the position that a returning citizen should have their full rights restored. And as I said, as I was about to say, this partial pardon business is very complicated and expensive. And that's the way we can message to people who perhaps are distressed by this or feel that it's not correct. It's going to happen anyway. A returning citizen is going to have rights restored. But so why make it complicated? Why do they have to wait? That's
yeah. So this, no, that was perfect. This is definitely the Let New York Vote Coalition, one of their top priorities, and certainly one of our top priorities as well. And then the last thing, which I think is pretty much a done deal, but I probably shouldn't say that to like jinx it, is the second passage of same-day voter registration and no excuse absentee voting. These will need accompanying statute legislation, and the NYCLU and also the attorney for Vote Early NY are already in the process, and the Brennan Center as well are already in the process of sort of drafting what the best legislation could look like. Same-day voter registration is like a little more complicated than even I thought, because essentially a voter who under the current statute that was put forward by a member of the legislature would basically have to vote by affidavit, and then they would have to prove after the fact that they were who they said they were. And so it's just very complicated. So that's in the pipeline, and I am happy to let Kate give any final comments and then open it up for questions.
Well, I with respect to the same day voter registration, I have to say that the New York City folks, the commissioners in New York City, we are one board of elections, although we are 5 counties. So these 10 commissioners, 1D and 1R meet as Jennifer mentioned, regularly. And they're not all that worried about the same day voter registration because they're gonna treat it the way they currently treat the affidavit ballots. So I was concerned, but they're not all that concerned. So it would require, I imagine, a special poll worker station at the polls. And so that someone who comes into the polls to vote and says, I've never voted before, then they'll say, oh, all right, we'll take care of you here. And then there'll be all their information, their registration will be taken as if, just like we would do if we were out registering voters. And then they will send that information to the state board and to the other agencies in the government that determine whether or not a person is a citizen and is an eligible voter. And if that turns out to be not problematic, then the individual will be notified that they are now a registered voter and their vote counted on that particular day. So.
Great. And I can't open my chat for some reason. So if there's questions I think it's because I'm screen sharing, but if there's questions in the chat,
there are some questions. So or one or two notes. So Gail, you want to
The question from Barb Thomas about early voting and primary hours. And do you want to unmute Barb?
Okay, I was just concerned because obviously this was a big election year and we're not really expecting that kind of turnout in the future. And like in Saratoga County, we, like even when they adjusted and everybody now has primary hours from 6 in the morning till 9 at night. And we had plenty of primaries where you might have 10 people come in all day anyway. So it seems like there should be some way of just.
Ellen Sullivan joined the meeting.
There should be some way of adjusting, like the number of early voting places needed, sort of based on an estimate. Obviously was way underestimated what we needed this time. But it does seem excessive maybe in some years where only 3 people want to go to the polling place.
Well, I don't have a copy of the early voting legislation in front of me, but it does require it does say that a maximum of 7 sites currently in the counties and 50,000 voters per site. If you only have 40,000 voters in a county, then you don't have to have more than 1 early voting site. That's the way the law is presently written. And I don't remember, Jennifer, do you remember what it says about the number of hours? I believe there is something in the statute about the number of hours that have to be.
I think so.
There's a certain minimum threshold. I forget what the minimum, I think it's gonna be 52. And then although I was wrong earlier about what the cap on the sites was, I completely forgot it was 7.
That's okay, 7.
And there is also a mandate that the hours should be both early morning and nighttime, but it doesn't say when that has to be early morning or nighttime. But I think your point about the primary is well taken, because when the regulations were drawn up for this, the Board of Elections, the commissioners at the state specifically had in their regulations that for primaries, rather than taking into account the total number of registered voters, counties could take into account just the registered voters of the party that was having a primary instead of the total of registered. So if it was only Republicans having a primary, they only had to do up to how many registered Republicans there were, not the total number.
And just a quick comment. I've seen, as a poll worker, I've seen actually where in local election years, you'll get a higher turnout for the primary sometimes than the general, because that's the real race in certain counties. So it varies, right? It can vary.
Yeah,
And yeah, and the law does include as well, the original law included that if counties felt like what they were being asked to do was an undue burden and not appropriate for their county, they could appeal to adjust the number of sites lower. I don't believe they can adjust the hours lower, but I think they can reduce back at least the sites if they felt like no one was coming and they didn't need to have as many sites.
Okay, I think there was one or two other comments and questions. I know we're running a little long. Gail,
You had a question or a comment about cross conversations with different leagues about defining Board of Election reform, and Kate already responded and said that's a great idea. And I will skip to Paula Brewer, who was just asking about the benefits of in-person versus absentee, which is less costly. And why is in-person the gold standard?
Well, from the league's perspective, we actually don't have a position making mail-in voting as the higher standard over in-person. Like, we don't have a preference. We just want maximum ability or maximum access, I should say. National doesn't favor one over the other. And at the state level, we actually don't have a position either. Like, we could at the state level make the decision to favor mail-in voting, though I will argue back that that's not necessarily the case, that absentee voting is cheaper than in-person voting, especially in a state like New York State, where we're not really well equipped to do absentee voting. I mean, certainly this time around, our first time of doing a huge, not all, but a very robust absentee rollout was quite expensive. And we didn't include return postage for our general election, which certainly the gold standard of a great mail-in voting system would give voters the proper postage to send their ballots back. Right. And for states that do have all mail-in or have mostly mail-in, it takes a couple of years before they see that return on investment. And even here in New York State, where we consolidated our primaries, we still haven't seen that return on investment yet. And we've been saying that, oh, we're going to save millions and millions by consolidating primaries, but we haven't seen that yet. It takes a long time to sort of beef up in funding before these things become extremely functional and practical for states.
Yeah, I don't know that I meant to use the phrase the gold standard. What I meant to say is that New York State election law is all about preserving the rights and the care and feeding of the political parties, and we have value in our work, the league's work, and all the voter advocates in pushing the legislators to say, okay, election law should be serving voters, not the political parties. It's the political parties who want you to vote in person, because they can control, they say they can send it, at least it used to be in the olden days, I guess, they would send their minions out and find out who hasn't voted. They'd go to the poll site, look at the voting, the paper registration record, who hasn't voted, and send people out and get those people to vote. They couldn't really control the absentee process, and they didn't want you to vote absentee. And absentee is complicated. You have, once the ballot comes in, you've got to determine that that person is an eligible voter. Does their signature match? It's complicated, and it is expensive. And regrettably, if there's going to be fraud in an election, it's much more likely to occur at that level than in the in-person level. Almost, I mean, we all know that in-person voter fraud is about as rare as getting hit by lightning.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks, Jennifer. I think we need to, for time reasons, move on. I don't think there's any other questions here. So why don't we go to the next topic?
Okay, great. Okay, so this is the one that I think we're going to gain some time back on, because this kind of happened yesterday. The Assembly and Senate adopted their rules. I have to be honest, I haven't had a chance to go perfectly through the rules because it's like a 40-page document, but the League, along with our good government partners and a broader coalition of groups, including disability rights groups, medical aid and dying groups, the NYCLU, called for basically remote transparency while the session is being operated remotely. And specifically, we were asking for things like access for people who have visual or hearing impairments, an option for people to call in to listen rather than to access by internet, because of course not everybody has broadband access, and some other things to just make sure legislators are actually paying attention. I've done a couple of remote hearings, and it's really frustrating when I see a legislator's name and I don't see their face. And it's like, are you there? Are you listening? Are you in the other room doing the dishes? I don't know. So this may come up again during session if we're hearing from the advocates, of all different kind of issue areas, that yes, it's a problem. I feel like my legislators aren't listening. And certainly this year, as I mentioned, is gonna be really weird because we can't just knock on someone's door. I can't just pull somebody off the floor of session to talk to them in the hallway. We really have to do everything remotely. And so that access is going to be extremely limited. So we want to make sure that the remote access that we do have is as accessible and transparent as possible. But I think unless anybody has any questions on that, I think we can actually move to the next slide. So I'll give a second for any questions.
No questions appearing.
Okay, cool. Okay, so redistricting is the next huge topic, and I just found out today that the piece of legislation, it's actually a constitutional amendment that we are opposing, is on the agenda in the Judiciary Committee in the Senate. So we had opposed a constitutional amendment to the new independent redistricting commission process, and to kind of take it back even further for anyone who wasn't around in 2014, which actually includes me. The New York State League of Women Voters had supported a constitutional amendment to create an independent redistricting commission that is comprised of 10 commissioners that are appointed by the Senate majority minority, the Assembly majority minority. Those are 8 of them, and then 2 of them are appointed by those 8 members, and those 2 have to be not a member of the major political party. So right now there's a conservative and a working families nominee on the commission, and the commission has started its work. And you might have seen an email go out that we're having a big campaign kickoff related to redistricting in New York State. We're really excited about it. It's redistricting is always a really exciting thing, I think, for every single state. And New York State is surprisingly gerrymandered for what you would think is a pretty progressive state. And we were very dismayed that during the pandemic in around July, the Senate and Assembly called for a hearing on the Redistricting Commission, which at that time had basically just finished being formed, hadn't even had a meeting yet, and had this hearing with advocates from all different kinds of groups, immigrant rights groups, civil rights groups, good government groups like the League. And basically we're like, what do you guys think? Like, what do you think this commission is going to be like? And we had said, we think that this constitutional amendment, which was supported by voters, is supported by you all when you passed it as well, because it had to be acted on by the legislature, voted into the Constitution by voters, and is now having its first chance to actually do its work. We shouldn't be messing with it right now. It's just starting. We haven't seen what the problems are. How could we be making fixes? We don't even know what the problems are. And some of the advocates disagreed and had a whole list of things they wanted to see changed, and that's fine. We don't agree on everything. And ultimately, the Senate and Assembly put forward a constitutional amendment that basically would change the voting structure of both the commission and the legislature itself to take away any sort of need for minority party buy-in. Okay.
Sorry, Jennifer.
That's okay. I was able to see the chat that time though. So basically it would take away any sort of minority party buy-in in both the process of the commission drawing up its maps and voting that way, and then also in the legislature when they vote to approve the maps that are created by the commission. We're very opposed to this. We issued a memo of opposition. It also changes the bipartisan co-executive directors, so that there still has to be 2 co-executive directors, but they don't necessarily have to be of different parties. And it does some other things too, which aren't necessarily bad things. So it changes the timeline to deliver the maps, which is an issue because our petitioning process for the Senate and Assembly is now butting up against the deadline to have those maps in the absolute drop dead deadline in February to have those maps approved. It also removes any language in the Constitution referring to aliens, which of course that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. and it puts constitutional language in there to mandate people who are incarcerated are reappropriated back to their last address, which is fine, but that's already the law anyway. It's not super necessary to do that. So we are opposing this constitutional amendment. I'm not exactly sure what our course of action is yet, because I just found this out right before this meeting, but stay tuned for more information on that tomorrow and then in the week ahead. But at the end of the day, this is supposed to be a bipartisan commission. Obviously, a nonpartisan commission would be ideal, but it's not. It's bipartisan, and that's fine. That's what we supported, and now we need to continue supporting them so that the minority party is not totally left out of the conversation when this is all happening.
There is a question in the chat about this. So, Gail?
Sorry, Lori Smith just asked about how can this matter for this coming redistricting if it's a constitutional amendment?
Yeah, and that is an excellent question, an excellent point, because it won't, because by the time they have second passage, the voters will have to vote on it, of course, and then it won't be enacted until January. But technically, like I said, the drop dead deadline is February. So if at that point they're still working on the maps, the whole structure of the voting would change for that second round of voting. But as I mentioned earlier, the Senate has a supermajority, the Assembly has a supermajority. It's really at this point, whatever maps they're going to do are probably going to lean a little blue. But our big issue here is that we don't want to mess with the process right now. We just got this constitutional amendment passed. If you wanted to do this, you should have done it before, when we had more time to have input, and as you point out, Lori, when it had time to actually matter.
Can I just add one thing? This is Laura Bierman. Patricia, can I just add one thing to this
Yes,
comment?
you can. Yes, you can.
Thanks. I just want to say that why this matters, Lori, to your question, is that we're very concerned that it could change the voting in the legislature of the proposed maps. If this comes in and is, through the referendum of next, wait a minute, I'm confused on the dates, 2022, then it could affect how the proposed maps are voted on in the legislature, even if the process itself, it's too late to affect the process itself. So that's one of our concerns, is that it could still have an impact by the voting mechanism used in the legislature, come that January.
Thanks. That's helpful. I think there's one other question. Gail?
Marion Bott is asking about when preliminary 2020 census data is going to be available that we could be able to use to understand what changes took place since 2010.
Yeah, great question. And Marion Bott, I didn't realize you were on earlier. Marion Bott is our financing education specialist. So I'm very happy you're on, so then you can talk about that, which I think is like 2 slides from now. But yes, great question. And I am this week participating in this redistricting. The National Council of State Legislatures is hosting this redistricting webinar that is super intensive. And they had someone from the census on that said, geographical data will be available either at the end of this month or beginning of February. So that's just kind of like the other, not the exact counts, but kind of the other data you need to like lay over the counts. And the counts data will probably be in July, which is so late considering we were expecting it in April. But that's what they're saying now, and it's really going to crunch the timeline for the commission to have the 12 mandated hearings they're supposed to have. They did say at their last meeting they're thinking about doing pre-data hearings and post-data hearings, which could be great, but as long as there is a time after the post-data hearings to actually comment on the maps that they're going to propose. So we might have to have 3 sets of hearings, which in a very small time frame could get a little hectic.
There's
Okay, go ahead.
just more of a comment, I would say, from Margaret Daines about Pennsylvania engaging the services of a professor from Stanford University to work on redistricting. I don't know that there's a question about it, but That's it.
Great.
The point being that instead of a commission, they just engaged a nonpartisan professional person. And apparently they had some very bad gerrymandering in Pennsylvania. And apparently he did a really good job. And he doesn't owe anybody. And it's a lot easier one person doing it if you can find somebody who's really good at it. And so my question is, maybe looking at that rather than a commission appointed by political party, blah, 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 might be a straighter line to accomplishing what we want to accomplish. So.
It's a big jump though, Margaret. It's definitely a big jump from where we are. So that would be interesting to see how New York State would actually, come across on that, but.
Oh, I know.
Interesting point.
Yeah, but Pennsylvania did do it, and I think it was an interesting case. So,
Margaret, this is Laura again. There's a movie about the Pennsylvania redistricting, and the league did play a big role in that, and it is featured in the movie. I can't remember what the name of it is right now, but Margaret, you have to realize this only happens every 10 years. What you're talking about is another change that requires a whole nother constitutional amendment. There's no way any of that can happen this time. You can talk about it later for 2030 census, but nothing, none of that can happen for this census. We need to deal with where we are right now. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Laura.
Yep.
Okay. I think we're on to the next topic then.
Great. And this one should be a pretty short one too. So we, as far as judicial issues go, our big focus last year, pre-COVID, was court reform, and mainly looking at consolidating New York State's 11 courts into 6. I don't know why my numbers, I thought it was 8. I'm not good with numbers today, but to give you kind of the broader big picture, this one, at the point where COVID was starting in March, we had a number of lobby meetings, but at that point there wasn't actually legislation introduced. It is a constitutional, or it would take, I should say, a constitutional amendment. And we are working with the Simplify the Courts Coalition, and they are a group of lawyers and different representations of these different courts, but also a lot of social welfare groups and groups that deal specifically with low-income individuals who do have to navigate these court systems, whether they're getting a divorce or going through child custody or any sort, or housing issues, any sort of issues like that. And it's extremely complicated right now. New York State has probably the most complicated system in the United States. And it's particularly harmful for those who are low income, because a lot of times, let's say you wanted to get a divorce, you're a victim of domestic violence and you're trying to get a divorce. You have to go to like 4 different courts to make that happen. You have to go to a court related to your domestic violence claim. You have to go to a separate court for divorce. You have to go to a separate court for child custody. There's just so many different layers for New York State's court system that it's just unduly onerous on whoever is trying to navigate it, to the point where people give up and they just stay in their bad situation. That's definitely not what we want. So I would definitely recommend, if you have more questions on this, to check out the Simplify the Courts website. It's simplifythecourts.org. Or I could try and answer your questions on this, but I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not as good at this topic. I rely a lot on Denise Kronstadt for a lot of this, for the Fund for Modern Court. She's great.
Yeah, I had a question. I don't know whether you know this off the bat, whether you know where family court matters would be handled.
In family court, I'm assuming.
No, I thought there, oh, sorry. I was looking at the slide and I thought on the right were the left
oh, no, sorry. And I pulled this graphic from the Simplify the Courts website, but I should have put a little thing. The left is what we have currently, and the right is what they're hoping to accomplish.
Right. So that's where I was wondering where the family court stuff would be, but that's fine if you don't, if you don't know. But do you have an idea of whether this is something that's been going on for a number of years, what the likelihood of this happening is, or no?
I think it might not be as likely this year, but the good news about it being a constitutional amendment in this case is we have a lot of time to get it done, so we can really make it perfect. But I know Denise, who's leading the Simplify the Courts Coalition, has been starting to reach back out to plan for next year. I haven't had a chance to have a conversation with her, but it was something. It would have been a huge issue for us last year had COVID not hit and totally derailed all our stuff, because this is definitely one of the main things that I was working on at the Capitol.
Thanks, Jennifer. On to the next.
Great. So this one, I'm sorry for some of these wordier slides. It just helps me remember some of these more complicated ones. But JCOPE reform is another constitutional amendment, and JCOPE is our Joint Commission on Public Ethics. They're in the news a lot because they are basically supposed to be an independent agency that is not independent at all. The commission is all appointed by the people it is supposed to be making sure is abiding by ethics laws. So their friends appoint them, and then they are supposed to oversee their friends. So it's not an ideal structure. It's legislatively appointed. The governor always has somebody in there who has really close ties to him. And they're supposed to basically investigate and pursue any sort of reported issue of ethics violations. They don't really do that. So the amendment that we are working on is an anti-corruption amendment that would, instead of having JCOPE be appointed by the legislature, it would have the Commission on Judicial Conduct appoint the commissioners to the commission, and would also actually give them some teeth so that they could take action when they are finding any sort of ethical conduct violations, which would include any sort of sexual harassment violations. And it allows them to fine people and even go all the way to remove any sort of non-elected public officials, any state employees, and then also to recommend to remove any elected official who is seen to have a lot of ethics violations. And of course, New York State has a lot of legislators like that, unfortunately. They also have a great website. Although I went on it today and I noticed that I think they took some stuff off. I think they're kind of re-getting it together for the new year. JCOPE must go. I can't remember if it's .com or .org, but JCOPE must go, and they have a website just like the Simplify the Courts one. Not as pretty as the Simplify the Courts one, though, I will say.
Okay, I don't think we have any questions on that. So why don't we move on?
Great. And next up is education financing, which, Marion, do you want me to turn off my screen share so we can all kind of see each other again? I think it makes sense anyway.
It's completely up to you, Jennifer.
I'll turn it off because I think Barb Thomas is after you anyway, and Barb has her own slide. So I'm going to turn it over to Marion Bott, who is our very excellent education financing specialist.
Okay. Hi everybody. This is going to be a weird year for education finance lobbying, because usually the drill is the budget comes out and we look at the budget, and this is, to be more specific, I look at the pre-K through 12 budget. Reluctantly, I must admit that whatever happens in higher ed, I have neglected as your issue specialist. And yet one more plea: if someone is an expert in, has background in higher education, we have positions about higher education, but going through the education budget that covers pre-K through 12 is such an undertaking that I promised myself not to dilute my effort. So I have reached out to the governor's new, well, he was there last year, a guy named Klapat, Mr. Klapat, to find out when we're going to see the budget. Someone on this call may know more than I do about that, but there's nothing on the Division of the Budget website right now that reveals a date. And logic tells me that Cuomo's team waited until all the shoes dropped in Washington. And that's logical, because there's such a huge difference between a budget that would be done with very, very limited federal aid to education and a budget that would be done in anticipation of it. That said, the timing of federal money it's not going to really help the budget because of the way they do. They forward fund in the federal budget, as you all know. So it doesn't directly help this year, but it's something that makes the legislature feel a lot better about where they're going to get aid for the children in the highest degree of need and the children with special needs if they have more federal funding. Anyway, so the difference will be this year, everything will be remote, and I'll do the best I can. I want to say also that the last day and a half, if that does not validate the work that the league needs to do in civics education in the schools, I don't know what does. I've never been quite as appalled, having been a lobbyist in volunteer capacity, and then also when I was on Wall Street. I've been in the halls of the Capitol. I've been in those little tunnels. I've gone to make many appointments in Washington, D.C. And the fact that people don't understand why they lost and what a government, basically what a government process is. It means that they really must have dropped out of school in 6th grade or just never paid any attention. So that saddened me, and I do hope that we, in one way or another, as a league statewide, are able to pull ourselves together to work on getting more civics education into the schools. And I'll look at that. The other things that's going to be happening this year, which I don't believe, according to my conversations with Sally Robinson, that we will be participating in at the state level, but at the city level, there may be some taxes that will be considered to increase funding in New York City. One in particular is called the pied-à-terre tax. But we at this point don't have what is deemed an appropriately strong, specific position to talk about specific revenue measures. So we are stuck in the same position that we've been in, well, at least for the 20 years I've been doing this, where we can basically bang our shoe on the table and say, please distribute the money more fairly, more equitably, et cetera. And please, fund a quality education for every child. But especially with the drastic situation with the health budget this year and all the needs in the health area, it's really hard to say, oh, look, just came across my screen. Trump concedes.
Oh,
just came across my screen. Anyway. So I think that's all I have to say. Look forward to seeing all you remotely and calling on any and all members of the Albany area leagues to join me in lobbying by remote processes.
so Marion,
It doesn't even know what the budget is, that is.
So Marion, as a novice in this area, can I ask a question that might just help me better understand? Would you say that the process of how the money gets down to the schools is majorly broken, or is it just that there's not enough funding as a whole, or a bit of both? Is the process
okay? It's minorly broken.
Okay.
I'm not going to go. I'm not an extremist in that respect. I mean, we do get the money from the federal and the state level to the school level. But when we have a pandemic and suddenly there's across the board announcement that the school districts are going to be withheld to the tune of 20% of the funding that they were expecting, this is a disaster. And you couple that with remote learning and the inequities associated with the lack of broadband on the part of the poor families. Yeah. And New York City is working on that. So it's not completely broken, but these were challenges that were already great before the pandemic to provide equity between kids who had computers at home, had broadband at home, and those who didn't. So that will be a big issue this year to make sure that the technology is addressed.
Yeah, it just seemed that there was a lot of stuff locally that when everything got cut. It seemed that the urban schools felt it much more than the suburban schools. So I didn't know if there was something, that was a muck there.
Well,
But
it's because the poverty is deeper and the funding formulas are not sufficiently robust to address the differences between school districts where there's a high degree of poverty and the districts that have plenty of property tax revenue coming in because they're wealthier districts. The state tries its best, so does the federal level, but local control always fights back and says, we don't want less money for our schools.
got it. Thanks. I don't know if I don't see any questions. Does anyone have any? Otherwise,
I'm just going to ask, Lori Smith had a comment about the state of the state, but I'm not sure if that is a question. So Lori, I have to ask you, is it related to education finance?
Just when the state of the state comes out, I bet.
It was related to funding for, he's already announced certain issues for bringing in dollars.
Oh, January the 11th, that's what Lori's saying.
Yep.
Yeah, but I'm
Yeah,
not sure. It's
Yeah.
related
So
to-
whether he comes out with a budget on the same day as the state of the state is still unknown. Right, Lori? Lori?
I wanted to ask a question about education funding. So I guess it's two-pronged. If we had a fair funding formula to distribute state and federal aid, would that address the inequities of property taxes for school? And the other part of that is, where is the league on moving away from funding schools with property taxes? Because it leads to such a dichotomy, of poor districts because based on property tax assessment versus richer, more wealthy districts being able to fund their schools to a greater degree because they're wealthier. So I was curious about that.
Okay, so to answer your second question first.
Excuse me, I'm sorry, I kind of lost my connection, but I'm back. Just to explain why I gave that information, I don't know if that means that Cuomo is going to talk more about his budget on Monday, but he's already talked about some revenue streams that he would need to talk about.
That makes sense. Thanks, Lori. Yeah, you can't do education funding equitably. Back to Paula's question, you can't do education funding equitably if you don't have a robust stream of sales tax revenue coming in and income tax revenue coming in. Back in 2004 through early 2006, we did our most recent in a series of, it seems as though we did it about every decade from the 80s and the 90s, then we did it one again, as I said, 04, 05, 06. We looked at all the ways and means that education is funded in New York State, and our position is fairly specific to the effect that we believe in progressive taxation. But that does not mean that we don't include properly structured property taxes in the mix, because if you cut off property taxes from the mix, you are totally, here, the pandemic is a perfect example of it. You cut off, your ability to fund something just by using only sales taxes and income taxation. And then the next thing you know, the economy is in the tank. That's why I'm so interested to see what the budget is. I want to see what their projected revenues are for the fiscal year. Beginning April 1st, as you guys know, and ending March 31st. But our league position goes further to say that we want the property tax system to have some characteristics that we specify in our position. We want the collection system to be fair and equitable within any given jurisdiction. And we never have favored either the property tax cap or the sort of mechanisms that were put in place with the STAR program. That was, frankly, one of the impetuses for that study was that we didn't have a position on STAR when it was introduced by George Pataki in 1998. And so we needed to have a position on STAR, which required a study. And so all the leagues got involved, and we said we would prefer a property tax circuit breaker, so that if you are really a needy family and your property taxes are killing you, that there would be a numerator and a denominator that would say, you know, we only earn this, and yet we're being asked to pay that, and it's too much. So it has not been what I would call a hot ticket lobbying item. It's in our position. I say it every time I've asked. But then to your first question, for the most part, it does boil down to quantity, because that's where you get the consensus. You get the consensus that everyone wants more money for their school district. I take it back. You may have a consensus, but you don't have absolutely everybody in the state saying that they need more money. Some of them will say to the contrary, that they don't believe that monies are well spent, et cetera. So we also believe in accountability measures to make sure that the money does go to the right places. So I think I will be happy to go on, but I think that will not work with your time schedule tonight.
Thanks, Marion. Really do appreciate it. Okay, I think that we're up to the next topic, which is Ms. Barb Thomas. And sorry, Barb, that I know you so well as everything else besides a specialist that I sometimes forget you're a specialist. Go for it.
I want to see how I can share my screen, and here we go. Let me do. If I can get this. I just wanted to make sure that.
Just do from beginning. You should be good.
Yeah, I think. Okay, there it is. I guess I didn't click enough. Oh, so.
And then just hit enter. Yep.
Yeah. And actually, I need to get a few little things out of the way. Okay, so in women's issues, first of all, let me just say that women's issues is like a convenient term for us. These are obviously issues that affect everybody, but they came up originally as women's issues. So, I mean, even things like reproductive health issues are really everybody's issue. But anyhow, so one of the first things that we do work on is fair pay. And we are, want to say, including passage of equal pay for job titles of comparable work. So we've been working on that since the 80s, and we make slight progress. And there is some talk about comparable work this year. We'll see. I don't think it's going to get to actually passage this year, but so that's one issue that we kind of monitor and work in coalition on. But one of the things that will be happening as a part of that issue is for fair pay for caregivers. And for their the child care agencies, the agencies that deal with the aged, both nursing home and home care sort of thing. So that will be one issue. Domestic violence is a part of the women's issue agenda, but I'm not at all really an expert on it. Sometimes we join a coalition action on domestic violence, but we do support protections against discrimination against victims of domestic violence. So that means that, like in public housing, things like that they cannot be discriminated against, and we work on that. We had some really great gains on reproductive rights in 2019 that we passed the Reproductive Health Act. But we do support that as an issue of privacy under the government issues, but everybody thinks of it as a woman's issue, even though it's a family issue. But funding is going to be an issue. Again, all healthcare funding is going to be an issue this year. And so we'll, again, work in coalition with some other people and support their efforts. And we do support passage of the state equal rights amendment. New York State, as you know, has already passed the national one, and we'll see what the Senate does on that issue now that the control of the Senate has changed at the national level. But at the state level, where they're working on the exactly how to do the wording so that you protect people. And then this is going to be more than just equal rights for people of the same, opposite sexes, because it's going to be all kinds of gender expression, all different kinds of disabilities maybe. So we have to work on it so that you don't lose protections that people really need, but that you also make things more equitable. And then medical aid in dying, I think, has a good chance moving ahead. So I want to spend a bit more time on that. Our death with dignity statement of position, there it is. We believe that people should have access to medical help if at the end of their life, if they would like to die more quickly and more peacefully. And we also believe, of course, that there have to be safeguards so that people don't make that decision for the dying person against their will, and that we protect the medical personnel who do act in good faith. So that's where we stand on that issue. And I think we are going to ask members of local leagues to participate in what we're going to adapt from the compassion and choices issue, because it's going to help our leagues members to actually do some lobbying in this time where you can't go in person. So we want to have you reach out to your assembly and senate members, telling them why. And especially, it's very good if you can think of a really true story that, your mother was, in terrible pain or something like that. So you need to think about those issues, and because the specifics of each person, when you talk to your legislator, really does move them. So be thinking about it. And then there's a part of this campaign just to show that you're from the area that legislature is in, is to have a few of you, one of you, with a sign that says something clever, if you can do it, but in a really recognized landmark in your district, so that, like I'm thinking in Saratoga, okay, well, you could be in Congress Park by Spit and Spat, which everybody would recognize, and have some sort of a picture of the three of you saying medical aid in dying, stand to spitting chance, or something like that, and then you tweet it, and you will send it to those tweets at your legislature, legislator, but also to the league, your own league, and to the state league, so that there can be retweeting and everybody will see and everybody be retweeting those things. And then there's a campaign for writing letters to the editor, also provide. And so the league would, for this campaign, be providing things like the Twitter handles of all of the legislators in the state. We will provide letters to the editors that you can adjust and put things in for your state, for your local league. And we're going to time this campaign so that it takes place after the budget is adopted. But right now, you can be thinking about places to take pictures and, thinking about even how to use some of these social media platforms that you may not use very frequently. And those are things that you can do, remotely. So that's good. So I'm going to stop sharing.
Yep, and we definitely have some questions here for you.
Okay.
Go ahead, Gail.
Okay, I'm going to just first go to actually Marion Botts about if we have access to state-by-state comparison of the laws in this area, Barb.
Well, when we did the study and the concurrence a bit ago, we looked at Oregon and Washington, which were the first states, and now there are quite a few more states that have adopted it. Even New Jersey now, just last year or the year before, adopted medical aid in dying. And they were all very similar pieces of legislation.
Okay.
Did I answer your question, Marion?
Marion,
did I answer your question?
So I don't want to get gruesome, but my sister passed away in Colorado this past summer. And one of the subjects of discussion in the family had to do with this area of the law. So I guess my question is, when you are comparing these other states, did you run across a situation where the hospitals where doctors might work were affiliated with a religious entity, and therefore it was not possible to move forward because they had religious objections? The doctor, let's just say you worked for St. Joseph Hospital or you worked for a Jewish hospital, and you might personally think that medical aid to your patient was fine, but you couldn't do it because of your institution. So I'm curious whether that came up in your research.
Well, what did come up is that it's often difficult to find a doctor who will agree to provide the service. And all the laws do, and the proposed law for New York State do require that you find a doctor, at least. Sometimes, I think it might even be that you have to have a consultation with another doctor. And the reason for that is that this is a change in our laws from being very horrified that people might prefer to end their life rather than to suffer. And so there's a lot of concern about making sure that people are not coerced into that. So, this law that we're lobbying for is not going to solve every problem. It doesn't solve the problem of people who have Alzheimer's because they're not able to consent when they get within 6 months of their death. So it's this law and all the laws that have been passed really err on the side of protecting people from coercion and are not as user-friendly as you might hope.
So does it require more than one doctor or not? The New York proposed law? What?
I think it does, too.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah,
I
Gail.
have to ask, Mary Bilby has a question about minimum wage. And
Yeah, the question she had is really, do we have a position on minimum wage, and would that solve the fair wage issue for childcare and senior aid workers?
We have a position not on the living wage, and we adopted it 2 years ago after a short, I don't know if it was a study or I don't think we did concur with a position on what should make up a living wage. And so that's a part of our positions. And I'm not exactly sure whether that was a study. It was a concurrence and it was a small committee. I remember that I actually put it together, and it was with Sarah Wolken from Binghamton and a few, not very many people. And we did use, so we were able to support the move to the minimum wage that New York State adopted, where was at $15 for New York City. And it started out in this area at $11.80, which has now this year, because of the passage of time, moved to $12.50. So, that whole fight for 15 really didn't change things that much across the state. It did raise some wages, but it's not going to affect most of those childcare workers. They need more than the minimum wage, which is not a living wage.
Big difference.
Yeah. And Mary Kate Owens asked about if there's been a state, has any state implemented a comparable pay for comparable work?
No. Other countries have. Canada has it. New Zealand has had it for a while. They're doing more, but no state in the United States has done it.
Sad.
There was a comment that Paula Brewer had that was related to what you were talking about before, about issues related to reproductive rights and women's access to care, and that there were some concerns locally with some hospitals taking over non-sectarian hospitals that were religiously affiliated hospitals taking over the non-sectarian ones. I do want to say that we do have some education questions that we left behind. So,
well,
Mary,
we still have environmental. Let's do environmental first.
right, I just don't want Marion to leave.
Well,
okay, yeah, and so that was Paula who asked that question, and that's been an ongoing problem. And you just really need to turn out to those hearings that the Department of Health, well, I don't know what they're doing during the pandemic, but ordinarily they would be holding hearings on consolidation. And the public needs to speak at those things.
it's important. Okay, we're running a little short on time, so we're up to environmental. Good conversation though, thank you.
Yeah, and I think we might make some time back again. I don't have much prepared for environmental. I was hoping Beth Ratto was going to join us, and I wasn't able to get an update. But we do have Mary Bilby on the Zoom with us, who is part of our statewide environmental issues committee. So, Mary, I don't know if you want to talk about what's going on with the committee. Not to put you on the spot, sorry. Still on?
Yeah, let's see. Mary, are you there? Can you help?
Mary has to, she has to unmute herself. She doesn't have a mic, she said. She
Oh,
wrote,
no.
yeah.
Oh, no, sorry about that. But yeah, like I said, I don't know if I have much. We always work on different climate issues and hazardous waste issues, and also clean air and water is usually big priorities for us. I don't know of any legislation right now that we're directly working on. We take a lot of guidance from some of the other bigger environmental groups like environmental advocates. But if other things come up, I will definitely keep people informed, and hopefully we can get a report from Beth Ratto after the fact that we can share with everybody too.
Thanks, Jennifer. Okay, so we did, oh, there's a question here about environmental, any involvement with the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. Do we know? Thank you, Ona.
I can't say for certain.
Okay, so we'll take it as a takeaway to come back.
Yeah, Beth and her committee are so great at flagging things we should be signing on to, and then we just sort of like are like, okay, great, we'll sign on, awesome. And then I should have went through my folder from this year before this, but yeah, I'll get you a report on what's going on after the call.
Thank you. Okay,
Just
so
to add something to that, because that act already passed, and but it's sort of just a generic thing, and now specific parts need to be implemented. So I think that's what will be coming up in the legislature.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes.
So with respect to that, the two immediate requirements that came out of the act were finalized, or one of them has already been finalized, but the other one is close to it. But all year, the Climate Action Council has been meeting. It's a council of 22 appointed people. And then they're supported by advisory panels who are supported by staff working groups. So I think at the end of this year, the Climate Action Council will have a scoping plan with regulations and that sort of thing that needs to move forward. I don't know how involved we get, but this is the time that the decisions are being made about what future policies will be happening after that scoping plan is released. So I don't know if we want to be or are involved at this stage or not, but I just thought I'd bring it out. Thank you.
Thanks, Ona. I just want to ask a question that's related in a sense, because Jennifer, you talked about how Mary Bealby is on that statewide issues committee. If others want to get engaged, how do they find? Because I happen to know that in the local area, there's a lot of stuff going on. And particularly in Albany County, we have two major things happening. But how do people, for all the statewide issue stuff, is there regular committee meetings, and how do people get engaged, I guess, is part of what my question is.
Yeah, and as far as having committees within the different issue areas, not necessarily. So the environmental one, I believe, was formed like a couple of years ago, and Beth had kind of gotten everybody together, and I think it was actually created at a convention, like a league convention, and I could be totally wrong here, but this is my recollection. And I don't know exactly when they meet to discuss things or anything like that. I'm not super, from the standpoint of the state league, we do take direction from national on what they want the states to focus on. And national really wants us to focus on voting, good government, and this year specifically redistricting. So the other issues, we do definitely really rely on our issue specialists to keep us in the loop and to keep us informed. And as I'm sure everybody on the call knows, we're a one-woman show at the office when it comes to legislative things. So as far as getting involved with different issues, we don't have any sort of like committees or anything. I think the one issue that is going to have, well, for the voting, Let New York Vote does have a grassroots call every single week that we do participate in, and we have advertised that in the past. So that's one way to kind of get involved with the voting issues. With redistricting, we're going to have this new campaign, and there'll be new opportunities to get involved in that. And then with some of our other issue areas, I don't know if we have like a good mechanism for that right now, which is probably not a good answer. But
No, that's good. It helps to clarify.
Patricia, I can add a little bit more to that if you want. Again, this is Laura. The Environmental Committee, and which is actually the Committee on Energy, Environment, and Agriculture, and the Healthcare Committee are two committees at the state league level that were formed many years ago because there were a group of people who really wanted to be following those issues. And so the state league encouraged them to form this committee, but we also said, that's great that have a committee, but we needed one person to chair it or be the issue specialist so that when Jennifer has a question, she can just write, in this case, Beth, and say, Beth, what should we be doing on this issue? Or we've heard about this issue or something like that. Beth, in some cases, will respond immediately back to us and just give us what she thinks we should do. Or more often, she will reach out to her full committee and they will discuss it and keep Beth informed. Or if Beth's unavailable, Mary knows, there's other ones, Kay Wagner out in Tompkins, Beth Kelly down in New York City, and Mary. There's a group of them, and sometimes they hear of things and they talk about it in the committee and then it comes to us. So it's kind of a back and forth, which is really how we like issue specialists to work. We need their their expertise when we, because Jennifer can't know everything on every issue. So we need their expertise, but when we hear of something, we need to be able to contact someone and say, what should we be doing about this? So it's a back and forth. If there are people that are interested in working on other issue areas, certainly let Jennifer or me know, and we'll put you in contact with the issue specialist, because even if it's not a committee, if there's somebody else who's interested in working on these issues, it would be great, because as we all know, we need to be building more leadership and also transitioning so that as people move out, there's people that have been involved and know what's going on. So I would encourage anyone. Right now, formally, all we have is that Energy, Environment, and Agriculture Committee and the Healthcare Committee. But that doesn't mean we can't form them in other areas. We only have about 6 or 8 issue specialists right now, and you've heard from many of them tonight. The judicial area, we are talking to someone in New York City who's interested in being the issue specialist on that. But in the past, even on that, we had 3 different people who worked on judicial areas. So it's not a one-person thing. So if there are people who are interested in working on a certain issue, email Jennifer or me. Don't call the office right now. Phones are kind of out, and we're doing a little construction in the first floor. So we're all upstairs, and we're all working remotely. So shoot us an email. We're our first names, Jennifer or Laura at lwvny.org, or contact Patricia or your local league president, and they can, they know how to reach us real easily. And tell us that you're interested in a certain topic, and we'll make sure that we can connect you with the people who are working on that issue, because we would love assistance in any of these. And as Patricia mentioned, a lot of this, and this is where it gets a little bit iffy, and I know you're short on time, I understand, and I'm trying to talk fast. But there are also these issues you're often dealing with at a local level, and you're also dealing with them at a state level. If you're dealing with them at a local level, these issue specialists can help you develop testimony or develop expertise on the local level. Our issue specialists tend to help us at the state level. And local leagues, just for those of you who are newbies, local leagues cannot take action on a state level without getting permission from the state league. So there is a little bit of a difference there, but if there's an issue, like Patricia said, there's a lot of environmental issues going on in Albany. And I know in the past on the oil train issue, Beth Ratto was very helpful to you all in Albany in developing testimony and writing letters for that. So our issue specialists can help our local leagues too, but their main focus is on issues at the state level. So I know I've said a lot there, but basically the bottom line is if you're interested in a topic, and just let us know and we'll connect you up with the right people, and we'd love to have more assistance.
Thank you, Laura. And maybe even a little bit of a something to think about for convention in terms of having more discussion around this, because I do think there's a lot of people who would like to get engaged, but just don't know how, and some might really come forward. So that'll be great.
Great idea. And Patricia, we have asked everybody, anyone who has ideas for workshops for convention, it's probably going to be virtual, but please shoot us an email and let us know. And we're happy to try and organize them. So yeah, let us know any of those great ideas you have.
Yep, absolutely. Thumbs up. Okay, I know there was a couple of questions we didn't get to, but we're actually short on time. So what I'd like to do with that is basically we're saving the chat and we will make sure that people get answers to the questions. And at the same time, Jennifer, was there anything that you really wanted to add before I do a little last minute closing?
Nope, just to say thank you for having me, and thank you to the issue specialist Barb and Marion, and I know Kate had to drop off, that were able to join us, and
yeah,
for all
absolutely.
the great work that you do otherwise too.
Jazz hands, right? Okay, so I just as well, I really do want to thank everyone who did attend. I'd like to see that we do this regularly on an annual basis across the Capital Region, and hoping we could do that. There will be copies of the slides available. So those who registered, if you didn't register, you know, that's then let your local league know. But we'll send out copies of the slides to people as well as follow up on the chat. And also, if you Jennifer, why don't you let people know, does everyone get the legislative updates that you send out weekly, or do they have to sign up for that?
Yep, we send the Friday legislative update to all members in our member list, though I think Laura has to update it because I don't think it's been updated since September. So,
okay.
And they usually go out Fridays around 4 o'clock. So if you're like, hey, I haven't been getting them, check your junk email box tomorrow. They might be in there.
It's actually since late October, I updated it. But this is the really important thing for local leagues, to make sure that the members' email addresses are in the US database. That's where we pull them from. If they're not in there, then they will not be receiving this information.
So anyone who isn't getting them, who wants, contact your local league president and so forth, and we'll resolve those issues if they happen. But again, go ahead, Jennifer, were you going to say something?
I was just, you can also just email me and I'll add you to the list too.
Good idea. All right. So with that, really do appreciate everyone's participation. Thank you so much to both Jennifer, all of the specialists. Really do appreciate all the hard work you guys do, and for making yourselves available to be on here. And we hope to keep in contact and talk to you all again. Everyone, have a great night.
Thank you, everybody. Happy New Year. Good night.
Yep. Happy New Year to everyone, and a great 2021 with change.